The morning sun painted the city square in shades of gold, but the girl sitting against the old stone fountain couldn't feel its warmth. Her stomach had been empty for so long that the hunger pangs had turned into a dull, constant ache. She pulled her thin jacket tighter, though it did little against the autumn chill that swept through the plaza. Her fingers traced the worn edges of her violin case. The instrument inside was probably the only thing of value she owned anymore. It had belonged to her grandmother, passed down through 3 generations of musicians. Now it sat in a battered case that had seen better days, just like her. The cafe across the square was buzzing with the breakfast crowd. Through the large glass windows she could see people laughing over steaming cups of coffee, breaking apart fresh croissants, and spreading jam on thick slices of bread. Her mouth watered at the sight. When was the last time she'd eaten a proper meal? 3 days ago, 4? The days had started to blur together. She opened her violin case, hoping that anyone might drop a few coins inside. The morning rush brought plenty of people through the square, but they all seemed to look right through her. Business people in sharp suits hurried past, checking their phones. Tourists studied their maps and took photos of the historic buildings. Mothers pushed strollers, chatting with friends, but nobody looked at the girl by the fountain. An hour passed, then another. The case remained empty except for the violin itself. She watched as a group of university students settled at one of the outdoor cafe tables, their laughter carrying across the square. They looked about her age, maybe a year or 2 older. Their backpacks bore the emblem of the prestigious music academy on the hill, the same school she used to dream about attending. That dream felt like it belonged to a different lifetime now. Back when she had a home, back when her grandmother was alive to teach her, to guide her fingers across the strings, to tell her stories about the great musicians of the past, back when music was about beauty and passion, not survival. The students ordered their breakfast without even glancing at the menu. They knew exactly what they wanted, speaking with the casual confidence of people who never had to worry about their next meal. Pastries arrived on white china plates, fresh orange juice in tall glasses, coffee in ceramic cups that probably cost more than everything she owned. She felt something harden in her chest. Not anger exactly, but something close to it. A desperate kind of courage that comes when you have absolutely nothing left to lose. Her grandmother used to say that music was the universal language, that it could bridge any gap between people. Maybe it was time to put that theory to the test. She stood up, her legs shaky from sitting too long and eating too little. With her violin case tucked under her arm, she walked toward the cafe. Each step felt heavy, like she was pushing through water. The closer she got, the more she could hear their conversation. They were talking about an upcoming concert, debating which pieces would be performed, discussing technique and interpretation in that casual way that showed how deeply music was woven into their daily lives. One of them, a boy with an expensive watch and designer sneakers, was doing most of the talking. He gestured with a half-eaten pastry, making some point about phrasing while crumbs fell onto his plate. His friends listened and nodded, occasionally adding their own thoughts. They looked so comfortable, so certain of their place in the world. She stopped a few feet from their table. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. For a moment she almost turned back. What was she doing? These people didn't want to be bothered by someone like her. They'd probably call security or tell her to get lost. But then her stomach twisted with another pang of hunger, and she remembered that she'd slept on a park bench last night because the shelter was full. She remembered washing her face in a public bathroom that morning, seeing her hollow cheeks and the dark circles under her eyes in the mirror. She remembered her grandmother's last words telling her to never give up on her music no matter what happened. She cleared her throat. The sound came out rougher than she intended. The students didn't notice at first, too absorbed in their discussion. She tried again, louder this time. Excuse me. They looked up, and she saw the exact moment when their eyes registered what she was. Not who, what, a street kid, a beggar, someone beneath their notice. The boy with the expensive watch frowned slightly and turned back to his friends, clearly hoping she'd take the hint and leave. She didn't leave. Instead, she spoke the words that had been forming in her mind during that long walk across the square. Can I play for a piece of bread? The question hung in the air between them. For a moment, nobody moved. Then one of the girls at the table snorted, trying to hold back a laugh. Another student smirked and exchanged glances with his friends. Even the boy with the watch couldn't hide his amusement. His lips curved into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You want to play for us?" he said, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Here? Now?" She nodded, gripping her violin case tighter. "Just for a piece of bread. That's all I'm asking." The students looked at each other. She could see them communicating without words, sharing that silent language that comes from spending too much time together. One of them shrugged. Another grinned wider. The whole situation clearly struck them as entertaining in some way, like a street performer doing tricks for tourists. "This should be interesting," one of the girls murmured, just loud enough for her to hear. Another wave of laughter rippled through the group. The boy with the watch leaned back in his chair, making a show of considering her offer. He picked up a small baguette from the basket on their table, breaking off half and setting it deliberately on the edge. The gesture was theatrical, almost mocking. He was treating this like a game, like she was some kind of curiosity put there for their amusement. "All right," he said slowly, that smirk still playing on his lips. "You can play, and if you actually manage to impress us, you can have this." He tapped the bread with one finger. "But it better be good. We're all music students, you know. We can tell real talent from street noise." His friends chuckled at that. Real talent. As if talent was something you could only find in expensive academies and concert halls. As if someone like her couldn't possibly understand what real music meant. She felt her jaw tighten, but she forced herself to stay calm. This was what she'd asked for after all, a chance. One chance to prove that music lived in her fingers just as much as it lived in theirs, academy training or not. She set her case down on the cobblestones and opened it carefully. The violin inside gleamed dully in the morning light, its varnish worn in places from decades of use. As she lifted it out, she could almost feel her grandmother's hands guiding hers, hear her voice reminding her to stand tall, to put her whole heart into every note. The students were still smirking, still waiting to be entertained by this unexpected interruption to their breakfast. Around the square, a few other people had started to notice the scene unfolding, but nobody really expected anything to come from it. They had no idea what they were about to hear. She tucked the violin under her chin, feeling the familiar weight settle against her shoulder. Her hands were shaking slightly, from hunger or nerves or maybe both. She took a slow breath, trying to steady herself. The students watched with barely concealed amusement, like they were waiting for a show that would give them something to laugh about later. Behind them, she could see other cafe patrons starting to pay attention. A woman with a newspaper lowered it slightly, curious. A man paused mid-bite of his breakfast sandwich. The servers slowed their movements, glancing over to see what was happening. She closed her eyes. In that moment, everything else fell away. The smirking faces, the empty stomach, the cold morning air. There was only the violin in her hands and the music waiting to pour out of it. She thought of her grandmother, of those countless evenings spent learning in the small apartment that smelled of old books and violin rosin. She thought of every lesson, every correction, every word of encouragement. Her bow touched the strings. The first note hung in the air like a question. Soft, almost hesitant. Then came the second and the third, and suddenly the melody began to unfold. She played a piece her grandmother had taught her years ago, something classical and achingly beautiful, the kind of music that carries weight, that tells a story without words. Her fingers moved across the fingerboard with a precision that came from years of practice, not the casual practice of someone with a passing interest, but the dedicated, hours everyday kind of practice that shapes muscle memory and soul together. Her bow work was delicate where it needed to be, forceful where the music demanded it. She swayed slightly with the rhythm, lost in the sound. The melody started to build. What began as something gentle transformed into something powerful, something that seemed to fill the entire square. Each note was crystal clear, perfectly pitched, executed with a technical skill that couldn't be faked or stumbled into by accident. She poured everything into that performance. Every cold night sleeping rough. Every meal she'd missed. Every time someone had looked through her like she didn't exist. Every memory of her grandmother's patient teaching. Every dream she'd had to set aside. All of it flowed through her fingers and into the music. The boy with the expensive watch stopped smirking. His mouth fell open slightly, his hand frozen halfway to his coffee cup. The girl who had laughed earlier sat completely still, her eyes wide. One by one, the students' expressions shifted from amusement to confusion, to something like shock. But she didn't see any of it. Her eyes were still closed, her entire being focused on the music. The piece reached its emotional peak, a soaring passage that required both technical mastery and deep feeling to execute properly. She nailed every note, her bow dancing across the strings, her fingers finding exactly the right positions without hesitation. Around the square, people had started to stop walking. A businessman in a gray suit paused on the sidewalk, his phone call forgotten. A young mother pushing a stroller came to a halt, rocking it gently while she listened. Even the servers in the cafe had stopped moving, standing still with their trays and coffee pots. The tourists who had been taking photos of the historic buildings turned their cameras toward her instead. An elderly couple sitting on a bench nearby leaned forward, their breakfast pastries ignored. A group of school children on their way to class stopped with their teacher, the whole line of them standing silent and attentive. The music swelled and fell, breathing like a living thing. There were passages that spoke of joy, others that whispered of sorrow. The complexity of the piece was obvious, each section requiring different techniques, different emotions. This wasn't simple street busking music. This was concert-level performance, the kind of playing that usually happened in halls where tickets cost more than she'd seen in months. She moved through a particularly difficult section, one that her grandmother had spent weeks teaching her. The notes cascaded like water, fast and precise, each one distinct yet flowing seamlessly into the next. Her fingers flew across the strings while her bow maintained perfect pressure and speed. It was the kind of passage that separated trained musicians from amateurs, and she executed it flawlessly. The cafe had gone completely quiet. Conversations died mid-sentence. The clinking of cups and silverware ceased. Even the espresso machine seemed to pause in its hissing. The only sound in the entire square was her violin, singing out a story of beauty and pain and survival. She transitioned into the final movement, letting the tempo slow, bringing the intensity down to something more intimate. This was the part her grandmother loved most, the gentle conclusion that tied everything together. The notes grew softer, more delicate, like a whisper or a prayer. Each one mattered, each one counted. Her bow moved with feather-light pressure now, drawing out sounds so pure and clear they seemed to shimmer in the morning air. The melody wound down gradually, reluctant to end, savoring every last moment. She held the final note, letting it sustain and fade naturally, her bow barely touching the strings. Then silence. She opened her eyes slowly, coming back to the present moment. Her hands were still shaking, but for a different reason now. The violin felt heavier than before, or maybe she felt lighter. For those few minutes, she'd been somewhere else entirely, somewhere the cold and hunger couldn't reach. The first thing she noticed was the student's face. The boy with the expensive watch sat frozen, his expression completely transformed. The smugness was gone, replaced by something between disbelief and awe. His friends looked equally stunned, their mouths slightly open, their casual confidence shaken. Then she heard it. A single pair of hands clapping, then another. Then suddenly the entire square erupted in applause. The businessman on his phone started clapping, phone pressed between his shoulder and ear. The mother with the stroller clapped enthusiastically, and her toddler tried to imitate her. The elderly couple on the bench rose to their feet, their applause vigorous despite their age. The school children and their teacher joined in, the kids bouncing excitedly. The cafe patrons put down their cups and papers to applaud. Servers clapped while balancing their trays. Even people in the upper windows of the surrounding buildings had stopped to listen, and now they clapped from their perches above the square. The sound washed over her like a wave. She stood there, violin still in hand, trying to process what was happening. She'd played for survival, for a piece of bread, expecting nothing but the fulfillment of a simple bargain. She hadn't expected this, any of this. The students at the table looked at each other, seeming lost. The girl who had laughed earlier had tears running down her cheeks now, though she didn't seem to notice. Another student was shaking his head slowly, like he couldn't quite believe what he'd just witnessed. The boy with the watch looked down at the piece of bread on the table, then back at her. His face had gone red, whether from embarrassment or emotion, it was hard to tell. He opened his mouth to say something, then closed it again. What could he possibly say? How could words follow what she'd just done? People started moving toward her. The businessman reached into his wallet. The elderly man was already standing, walking over with purpose in his step. The teacher was saying something to her students, gesturing toward the girl with the violin. She lowered the instrument slowly, suddenly aware of how tired her arms felt, how the adrenaline was starting to fade. Her legs felt weak and she worried for a moment that she might actually fall over. But she stayed upright, watching as the crowd began to gather closer. The elderly man reached her first. He was well dressed in a way that spoke of old money and good taste, his white hair neatly combed, his eyes sharp and intelligent behind wire-rimmed glasses. He looked at her with an intensity that made her want to step back. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked, his voice carrying authority but also genuine curiosity. She looked at the elderly man, unsure how to answer. Her throat felt tight, and she realized she hadn't spoken to anyone in days except to ask for spare change or directions to the nearest shelter. The words felt stuck somewhere between her heart and her mouth. "My grandmother," she finally managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "She taught me." The old man studied her face for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. He glanced at the violin in her hands, then back at her face. "That piece," he said slowly, "was written by a composer who believed music should come from suffering as much as from joy. He said that only someone who truly understood both could play it properly." He paused, his eyes never leaving hers. "You played it exactly as it was meant to be played." Before she could respond, the businessman who'd been on the phone stepped forward. He held out a handful of bills, more money than she'd seen in weeks. "That was extraordinary," he said simply. "Please take this." She stared at the money, frozen. Part of her wanted to grab it, to secure what she desperately needed. But another part, the part her grandmother had raised, felt strange about accepting it. She'd asked for bread, not charity. Though what was the difference really when you thought about it? Her hesitation lasted only a moment. Survival won out over pride. She reached out with trembling fingers and took the bills, mumbling a thank you that didn't feel adequate. "No, thank you," the businessman said. "I haven't heard anything that beautiful in years." He nodded once and walked away, already returning to his phone call, but his voice was softer now, less rushed. More people pressed forward. The mother with the stroller gave her a $10 bill and a protein bar from her purse.
"For later," she said with a kind smile.
The elderly couple offered more money, and the woman squeezed her hand gently. "Keep playing, dear. The world needs more beauty in it." One by one, people dropped money into her violin case. Coins and bills accumulated quickly, more than she'd made in the last month combined. Some people said nothing, just smiled and nodded. Others offered brief words of encouragement or praise. A teenager handed her an unopened sandwich from a convenience store bag. A woman in a business suit gave her a card for a local community center that offered meals and services. Through it all, the students at the cafe table sat in stunned silence. The boy with the expensive watch kept looking between her and his friends, his face still flushed. The piece of bread sat exactly where he'd placed it, but it seemed to mean something different now. What had started as a joke, a way to mock someone they saw as beneath them, had turned into something else entirely. The elderly man hadn't moved. He stood watching the scene unfold, his hands clasped behind his back. When the crowd finally began to thin, people returning to their morning routines, he spoke again. "How long have you been on the streets?" The question was direct but not unkind. She swallowed hard. 3 months. Since my grandmother passed away. And before that? You lived with her? She nodded. She raised me. We didn't have much, but we had enough. She gave music lessons from our apartment. That's how she supported us. The memories came flooding back, and she had to blink rapidly to keep tears from forming. When she died, I couldn't pay the rent anymore. I tried to find work, but nobody wants to hire someone my age without a diploma or experience. What about your parents? Never knew my father. My mother left when I was 4. It was always just me and my grandmother. She looked down at the violin. This was hers, and her mother's before that. It's all I have left of them. The old man was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a card. "My name is written here," he said, handing it to her. "I taught music at the conservatory for 40 years. I retired 5 years ago, but I still have connections throughout the city." She took the card with shaking hands. The name printed on it meant nothing to her, but the title beneath it made her breath catch. Professor Emeritus, Department of String Performance. Below that was an address for the same prestigious music academy the students attended. "I don't understand," she said. "That performance?" He gestured to where she'd been standing. was not the work of someone who dabbled in music. Your grandmother must have been an exceptional teacher. Your technique is solid. Your emotional interpretation mature beyond your years. Those are skills that take time and dedication to develop. She felt her chest tighten. She was the best teacher I could have asked for. She used to say that music was the one thing nobody could take away from you, that it lived inside you where nothing could touch it. She was right. The professor smiled, a sad but genuine expression. The Academy runs a program for talented young musicians who face financial hardship. It's not widely advertised, but it exists. Scholarships that cover everything: tuition, housing, meals, books, everything. Her heart started pounding. I don't have any official training. No certificates or competition awards or anything like that. The entrance audition is the only thing that matters. If you can play like you did just now, you'll have no trouble getting accepted. He paused, studying her carefully. But I have to ask, why were you playing for bread instead of pursuing opportunities like this? Surely you must have known you had talent. She laughed, but it came out bitter. Talent doesn't matter much when you're trying to figure out where to sleep at night. I've been focused on surviving, not planning for a future that seemed impossible anyway. She gestured to herself, to her worn clothes and the violin case that had seen better days. Who's going to take someone like me seriously? I am, the professor said firmly. And the Academy will if you let me help you. There are procedures to follow, applications to submit, but I can guide you through the process. The next round of auditions is in 2 weeks. 2 weeks. The timeline felt both impossibly far away and terrifyingly close. 2 weeks of continued uncertainty, of sleeping rough, of scraping by, but also 2 weeks until a possible door opening, a chance at the life her grandmother had always wanted for her. I don't know what to say, she admitted. Say you'll try. That's all I'm asking. She looked around the square, at the cafe where the students still sat in uncomfortable silence, at the fountain where she'd been sitting just an hour ago with an empty stomach and emptier hopes. Then she looked at the money in her violin case, enough to get her through the next few weeks if she was careful. Enough to eat properly, to maybe find a decent place to stay while she prepared. I'll try, she said, and the words felt like a promise. The professor nodded, satisfied. Good. Come to this address tomorrow afternoon. He tapped the card in her hand. We'll start working on your audition piece. You have talent, but talent alone isn't enough. You need to be prepared, polished. We have work to do. Before she could respond, one of the students from the table finally approached. It was the boy with the expensive watch. He walked slowly, like he wasn't quite sure what he was doing. His friends watched from their seats, equally uncertain. He stopped a few feet away, not quite meeting her eyes. In his hands was not just the piece of bread he'd offered as a prize, but the entire basket from their table. Croissants, rolls, pastries, all of it. I'm sorry, he said quietly. That was cruel of us. We had no right to treat you that way. He held out the basket. Please take this and... He reached into his pocket and pulled out more bills, adding them to her case. I hope this helps. She took the basket, surprised by the weight of it. Thank you, she said, and meant it. Not just for the food, though her stomach was already reminding her of how hungry she was, but for the apology, for the recognition that she was a person deserving of respect. He nodded once and returned to his table. His friends gathered their belongings quickly, leaving money on the table to pay their bill. They left without finishing their breakfast, without the laughter and casual confidence they'd arrived with. The square felt different somehow, quieter and more thoughtful. The professor watched them go. They learned something important today, he said. Never judge someone by their circumstances. You never know what gifts they carry inside them. She carefully packed her violin away, then gathered the money from the case. There was more here than she'd dared hope for. Not life-changing money, but life-sustaining. Enough for meals, for a cheap hotel room, for a chance to shower and sleep in a real bed. Enough for 2 weeks of preparation. Thank you, she said to the professor, for seeing me, for listening. Thank you for playing, he replied, for reminding an old man why he fell in love with music in the first place. He turned to leave, then paused. Tomorrow, 2 o'clock. Don't be late. I won't be. She watched him walk away across the square, his straight-backed posture speaking of a lifetime of discipline and dedication. Then she looked down at the basket of bread, at the money in her hands, at the card with his name and number. For the first time in 3 months, she felt something she'd almost forgotten. Hope. Real. Tangible hope that maybe her grandmother had been right after all. Maybe music really was the one thing nobody could take away. Maybe it could build bridges between worlds, open doors that seemed locked forever. She picked up her violin case in the basket and started walking. Not aimlessly this time, but with purpose. There was a community center 2 blocks away, the one the businesswoman had mentioned. They'd have information about affordable accommodation, maybe even a locker where she could safely store her grandmother's violin. The morning sun felt warmer now, or maybe she just felt it more. Either way, the weight of despair that had pressed down on her shoulders for months felt lighter. She had 2 weeks to prepare, 2 weeks to prove herself, 2 weeks to honor her grandmother's memory by showing the world what she'd taught her. And somehow, impossibly, she believed she could do it. The community center smelled like coffee and cleaning supplies. A woman at the front desk looked up when she walked in, taking in her appearance with eyes that had probably seen hundreds of people in similar situations. But there was no judgment there, just practiced kindness. "Can I help you?" She placed the business card on the counter, the one from the woman in the suit. "Someone gave me this. Said you might have information about places to stay." The woman nodded and pulled out a folder. "We work with several shelters and temporary housing programs in the area. There's also a weekly meal service on Tuesdays and Thursdays." She glanced at the violin case. "Are you a musician?" "I'm trying to be." The words felt strange coming out. For months she'd just been surviving. The idea that she could actually become something again, work toward a goal, felt almost foreign. 20 minutes later, she walked out with a list of addresses and phone numbers, including a women's shelter that had an opening for the next 2 weeks. It wasn't much, just a bed and a shared room and access to showers and lockers, but it was safe. That mattered more than comfort right now. The shelter was a 40-minute walk across the city. She didn't mind. The basket of bread from the students kept her company, and she ate as she walked, savoring each bite. Real food. When was the last time something had tasted this good? By the time she reached the shelter, afternoon shadows were stretching across the streets. The building was old but well-maintained, with bright yellow doors that seemed almost cheerful. Inside, another kind woman processed her paperwork and showed her to a room with 6 beds. 3 were occupied, their owners out for the day. "Lights out at 10, breakfast at 7, the woman explained. "There's a shower schedule on the wall. Laundry room is in the basement, but you'll need quarters." She handed over a key to one of the lockers. "Keep your valuables in there. We've never had problems, but better safe than sorry." That night she slept in a real bed for the first time in months. The mattress was thin and the room was noisy with 3 other women who snored or talked in their sleep. But she didn't care. She was warm. She was safe. And tomorrow she had somewhere to be. The next afternoon she stood outside the address the professor had given her. It wasn't the main academy building with its imposing stone facade and manicured lawns. Instead, it was a modest house in a quiet neighborhood, with a small garden and a brass nameplate by the door. Her hand trembled as she rang the bell. What if he'd changed his mind? What if yesterday had been some kind of fever dream and none of it was real? The door opened. The professor stood there in casual clothes, looking somehow both more approachable and more intimidating than he had in the square. "You're early," he said. "Good. Punctuality matters in this profession." He led her inside to a room that was clearly his personal studio. Sheet music covered every surface. A grand piano sat in one corner and several violins hung on the wall in glass cases. The afternoon light streamed through tall windows, making everything glow. "Let me hear you play something else," he said, settling into an armchair. "Something you choose this time." She lifted her violin from its case and thought for a moment. Yesterday she'd played something her grandmother loved, something that carried her grief and desperation. Today felt different. Today she wanted to play something that spoke of possibility. She chose a piece that was technically challenging but also filled with hope. Her fingers found the strings and she began. This time she kept her eyes open, watching the professor's face as she played. He listened with complete attention, occasionally nodding or tilting his head at certain passages. When she finished, he stood and walked over to her. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the violin. She handed it to him carefully. He examined it closely, turning it over, checking the wood and the strings. "This instrument has quite a history," he said softly. I can see the wear patterns, the repairs that have been made over the years. Someone loved this violin very much and played it constantly. My great-grandmother bought it in Europe before the war, she explained. She passed it to my grandmother, who passed it to me. It's been in our family for almost 80 years. The professor nodded. I can tell. Instruments absorb the music played on them, you know? They carry the spirit of everyone who's made them sing. He handed it back. Your technique is excellent, but there are gaps. Your grandmother taught you well, but she couldn't teach you everything. There are advanced concepts you'll need to master for the audition. He spent the next 2 hours working with her, breaking down complex techniques, showing her different approaches to difficult passages. He was demanding but patient, correcting her mistakes without making her feel inadequate. She absorbed everything like a sponge, her fingers growing sore from the repetition but her mind sharp with focus. That's enough for today, he finally said. Your fingers need rest and your brain needs time to process what you've learned. Come back tomorrow, same time. She returned the next day and the day after that. A routine developed. Mornings at the shelter, afternoons at the professor's house, evenings practicing in a small park near the shelter where she wouldn't disturb anyone. The other women at the shelter became curious about her constant coming and going with the violin case. One of them, a woman in her 30s who'd lost her job and apartment after a medical emergency, started staying to listen when she practiced. You're really good, she said one evening. Like professional good. What are you working toward? There's an audition in 9 days, she admitted. For a scholarship at the Music Academy. That's amazing. I hope you get it. The encouragement felt good. For so long, she'd been invisible. Just another homeless person that people looked past. Now she was becoming someone again, someone with a goal and a purpose. The professor pushed her harder each day. He introduced her to pieces she'd never attempted before, challenged her to understand not just how to play the notes, but why they mattered. He talked about music history, about the composers whose work she studied, about the emotional journeys embedded in each piece. Music is a conversation, he explained during one session. You're not just playing notes on a page. You're speaking to the audience, telling them something important. What do you want to say? She thought about that question a lot. What did she want to say? That she'd survived? That her grandmother's teachings lived on? That beauty could exist even in the darkest circumstances? Maybe all of those things. Maybe something she couldn't put into words but could express through music. On the 6th day, something clicked. She was working through a particularly challenging section when suddenly her fingers seemed to move on their own, finding the right positions instinctively. The music flowed naturally, effortlessly, like breathing. The professor smiled. There it is. That's what I've been waiting for. You've stopped thinking and started feeling. It just happened, she said, amazed. That's because you've put in the work. The technique is becoming automatic, which frees your mind to focus on the artistry. That's when real magic happens. By day 10, she felt ready. Nervous, but ready. The professor had her play through her entire audition repertoire 3 times, noting any mistakes or hesitations. There were fewer each time. You're prepared, he said finally. More prepared than many students who've trained for years. Tomorrow is just a formality. Show them what you showed me that first day in the square. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed at the shelter, listening to the familiar sounds of the other women breathing and shifting in their sleep. Tomorrow would determine everything. Tomorrow she would either take the first real step toward a future, or she'd be back where she started, playing for spare change and hoping for kindness from strangers. No, she thought. Even if the audition didn't go well, she wouldn't be back where she started. The professor had taught her things she'd carry forever. She'd learned that her grandmother's teaching had real value, that her skills were genuine. Whatever happened tomorrow, nobody could take that knowledge away. She finally drifted off sometime after midnight, dreaming of concert halls and applause, of her grandmother smiling from somewhere beyond, proud of the musician she was becoming. The morning of the audition arrived gray and drizzly. She showered carefully, washing her hair twice to make sure it was completely clean. The shelter didn't have much, but one of the women lent her a simple black dress that was appropriate for an audition. Another woman helped her with her hair, pulling it back neatly. You look like a real musician, the woman said, studying her reflection in the bathroom mirror. She did. For the first time in months, she looked like someone with a future instead of just a past. The professor met her outside the academy's main building at noon. He'd offered to come with her, to provide moral support and help navigate the process. She was grateful. The building was intimidating, all stone columns and heavy wooden doors, the kind of place that seemed designed to make you feel small. "Remember," he said as they climbed the steps, "they're just people who love music the same way you do. Show them your passion and your skill. The rest will follow." She nodded, gripping her violin case tightly. Inside, everything she'd worked for. Inside, her grandmother's legacy and her own dreams, all waiting to be heard. They opened the doors and stepped into her future. The inside of the academy was even more impressive than the exterior. Marble floors reflected the light from crystal chandeliers. Portraits of famous musicians lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to watch everyone who passed. Students hurried by with instrument cases and sheet music, their conversations filled with technical terms and casual confidence. She felt suddenly small again, out of place. These students belonged here. They wore the right clothes, carried the right bags, moved through these halls like they owned them. What was she doing here, pretending she could be one of them? The professor must have sensed her hesitation. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You belong here just as much as any of them," he said quietly. "More, perhaps. You've earned your place through genuine struggle and dedication. Many of these students have had everything handed to them." They walked down a long corridor to the audition room. Outside the door, several other candidates waited on benches, some practicing fingering patterns in the air, others reviewing sheet music with furrowed brows. They all looked polished and prepared, their instruments in expensive cases, their clothes perfectly pressed. A woman with a clipboard appeared. "You must be our 2 o'clock," she said, checking her list. "The scholarship candidate?" "Yes," the professor answered for her. "This is the student I mentioned." The woman's expression was professionally neutral, but her eyes lingered on the girl's borrowed dress and worn violin case. "The panel will see you in 5 minutes. You can warm up in the practice room down the hall if you'd like." The professor guided her to the small practice room. It was soundproofed and empty, with just a chair and a music stand. "Play through your scales," he instructed. "Get your fingers loose. Don't think about what's coming next. Just focus on the present moment." She took out her violin and ran through her warm-up routine, the same exercises her grandmother had taught her years ago. The familiar patterns calmed her nerves, reminded her that she knew what she was doing. This was just music. She'd been playing music her entire life. Too soon, the woman with the clipboard returned. "They're ready for you now." The professor squeezed her shoulder once more. "Remember what I told you. They're just people who love music. Show them who you are." The audition room was larger than she expected, with high ceilings and excellent acoustics. At the far end, 3 people sat behind a long table, papers spread out before them. 2 men and a woman, all older, all wearing expressions of professional assessment. They'd probably heard hundreds of auditions, listened to thousands of hopeful students. She was just another name on their list. "Please state your name and tell us what you'll be playing today," one of the men said. She spoke her name clearly, fighting to keep her voice steady.
"I'll be playing a selection from the standard repertoire."
"The first movement of the piece I've prepared demonstrates technical proficiency, and the second showcases emotional interpretation. Whenever you're ready," the woman said, pen poised over her notepad. She lifted the violin to her chin, positioned her bow, and paused. In that moment of silence, she thought about everything that had led her here. The cold nights sleeping rough, the hunger that gnawed at her constantly, the day she'd challenged those students for a piece of bread, her grandmother's patient teachings over so many years, the professor's kindness and guidance. All of it had brought her to this moment. She began to play. The first notes were tentative, careful. She could feel the panel's eyes on her, hear the scratch of pen on paper as they made notes. But gradually, as she moved deeper into the piece, the outside world fell away. There was only the music, only the story she was telling through the strings. She navigated the technical passages with precision, her fingers dancing across the fingerboard exactly as the professor had taught her. The difficult runs that had frustrated her a week ago now flowed smoothly. Her bow work was controlled, producing a clean, resonant tone that filled the room. But technique alone wasn't enough. She knew that, so she poured her heart into the music, letting every emotion of the past months flow through her fingers, the fear, the loneliness, the moments of despair, but also the hope, the determination, the love her grandmother had given her and the kindness strangers had shown. She transitioned into the second movement, slower and more lyrical. This was where she could really show them what music meant to her. Not just notes on a page, but a language for things too deep for words. She played with her eyes closed now, trusting her muscle memory, focusing entirely on the emotional journey of the piece. The melody soared and dipped, whispered and sang. She used dynamics the way a painter uses shades of color, creating texture and depth. In some passages she played so softly the bow barely kissed the strings. In others she bore down with full force, drawing out powerful resonant tones that seemed to vibrate in the very walls. Time became meaningless. She wasn't thinking about impressing anyone or proving anything. She was simply sharing what her grandmother had taught her, honoring the legacy of the instrument in her hands, speaking the only language she'd ever truly mastered. When the final note faded into silence, she opened her eyes slowly. The three panelists sat motionless, staring at her. For a long, terrible moment, nobody said anything. Had she done something wrong? Had they hated it? Then the woman cleared her throat. That was... She paused, seeming to search for words. That was exceptional. Where did you say you trained? I didn't have formal training, she admitted. My grandmother taught me from the time I was very young. She was a professional musician in Europe before she emigrated. The two men exchanged glances. One of them leaned forward. You're self-taught? Just from lessons with your grandmother? Yes, sir. Until 2 weeks ago when Professor... She gestured toward the door where she knew the professor waited. When he started helping me prepare for this audition. 2 weeks? The man looked stunned. You prepared this repertoire in 2 weeks? The pieces themselves I learned years ago. But yes, I've been refining them for the past 2 weeks. More glances exchanged between the panelists. The woman made several notes on her paper, underlining something multiple times. The silence stretched out, and with each passing second her anxiety grew. Why weren't they saying anything concrete? Finally, the woman spoke again. Can you tell us about your current living situation? The scholarship includes housing assistance, but we need to understand your circumstances. This was it. The moment where she had to admit what she was. She could lie, try to make herself sound more stable, more acceptable. Or she could tell the truth and risk them judging her, seeing her as too much trouble, too damaged by her circumstances. She chose truth. I'm currently staying at a women's shelter. Before that, I was on the streets for about 3 months after my grandmother passed away and I lost our apartment. I have no other family and no permanent address. She watched their faces carefully, looking for disgust or pity or dismissal. Instead, she saw something else. Respect, maybe. Understanding. That context makes your performance even more remarkable, one of the men said quietly. To maintain that level of skill and discipline under those circumstances shows exceptional character and dedication. The woman nodded. We need to confer briefly. If you could wait outside for just a few minutes. She packed up her violin with shaking hands and stepped back into the corridor. The professor stood immediately, his face anxious. How did it go? I don't know, she said honestly. I think I played well. They seemed surprised, but they didn't tell me anything definite. That's normal. They never commit during the audition itself. But even he looked nervous now, checking his watch, pacing slightly. Other candidates were still waiting, and she realized they'd probably heard her play through the door. A few looked at her with open curiosity. Others seemed nervous now, comparing themselves to what they'd heard. The minutes crawled by. 5, then 10. What was taking so long? Maybe they were debating whether someone like her really belonged at a place like this. Maybe they were trying to find a diplomatic way to reject her. The door opened. The woman with the clipboard stepped out. But instead of calling the next candidate, she looked directly at her. Could you come back in, please? And Professor, you as well, her stomach dropped. This couldn't be good. Why would they want the professor there? They walked back into the audition room together. The 3 panelists were standing now, which seemed more formal somehow, more official. The woman who'd been taking notes stepped forward. We want to start by saying that your audition was truly exceptional. In 15 years on this panel, I've rarely heard a performance with such technical skill combined with genuine emotional depth. Her heart pounded. That sounded positive, but there was a but coming. She could feel it. However, the woman continued, and there it was. Your situation is complex. The scholarship program is designed for students who need financial assistance, but you need more than that. You need stability, support, comprehensive services. This was it. The rejection. They thought she was too broken, too needy, too much work, which is why, the woman continued, and her expression softened into something almost like a smile. We're prepared to offer you not just the scholarship, but enrollment in our extended support program. This includes full tuition, private instruction, housing in our student residence, meal plan, and access to counseling services. Everything you need to focus entirely on your studies and your music. The words didn't make sense at first. She heard them, but couldn't quite process what they meant. What? You're accepted, one of the men said, smiling now. Welcome to the academy.